Cuba has long fascinated Americans, mostly because the United States has been obsessed with the Caribbean country. And because of this obsession, over the decades, millions of Cubans packed their bags and headed north, mostly to the state of Florida. So why is the United States so obsessed with Cuba? And why is Florida still home to the largest ethnically Cuban population outside of Cuba itself? Welcome to Geography by Geoff, and welcome to my new studio space. It's still very much a work in progress, but hopefully over the coming weeks, it'll all come together. Anyway, today we're going to visit the surprisingly long island of Cuba. Because while it's a completely different country, at this point, its story and history are deeply intertwined with that of the United States. And perhaps not surprisingly, geography plays an integral role in today's video. But first, be sure to check out this week's podcast episode all about the bicycle. The humble, pedal-powered vehicle has become synonymous with a few key regions around the world and has had a surprisingly large impact on global culture. You can listen to that episode right after this video by clicking this link or by checking out the description below. Long before Columbus set foot on its shores in 1492, Cuba was inhabited by the indigenous Taino peoples. These tribes led a relatively peaceful existence, primarily engaged in agriculture, hunting, and fishing. The Taino were known for their advanced agricultural techniques and hierarchical social structures. However, the arrival of the Spanish marked the beginning of a drastic change for the island. Spanish colonization decimated the indigenous population, primarily through diseases to which the natives had no immunity. By the mid-1500s, the Taino were virtually extinct, and with little resistance, the Spanish turned Cuba into a key transit point for ships heading to and from the Americas, transforming its economy and society. The introduction of sugarcane in the early 1500s eventually made Cuba the world's largest sugar producer, a development that had profound implications for the island's demographic and social structure. You see, the sugar boom was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, who were forcibly brought to the island to work in the fields. By the middle of the 1700s, Africans and their descendants constituted a significant portion of the population, with somewhere around 50,000 people enslaved, though this number paled in comparison to French Haiti's enslaved population of over 450,000. Regardless, as with many other colonies during this time, this period was marked by a series of uprisings from enslaved peoples and a growing movement for independence from Spain. Now, most former Spanish colonies struggled with gaining independence from Spain, but Cuba's struggle for independence was much longer and harder fought. The 10 Years' War, the Little War, and the Cuban War of Independence were key conflicts in this period. The latter conflict saw the United States intervene in 1898, leading to the Spanish-American War. The US victory led to the Treaty of Paris, which eventually granted Cuba independence in 1902, with the caveat that the United States could intervene in Cuban affairs, finances, and foreign relations. It's for this reason that the US has a military base located on Guantanamo Bay, despite an otherwise icy relationship. And today's current relationship is largely due to the Cuban Revolution of 1959, led by Fidel Castro. The revolution transformed Cuba into an authoritarian state and led to a significant realignment of the island's foreign policy, moving the country to have closer ties with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The United States has always had its eye on Cuba, but the country's realignment towards the Soviet Union in 1959 was something America just couldn't stand. After all, the two are very close to each other geographically. But before we explore the geography of Cuba, if you're enjoying this video, hit that subscribe button. More fun geography videos are just a single click away. Cuba, the largest island in the Caribbean, is an area of remarkable geographic diversity and beauty. Its physical geography, shaped by its position at the confluence of the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean, offers surprising diversity beyond what is normally thought of as a tropical island. The island itself stretches 750 miles in length, which is more than the distance between San Francisco and Seattle. But despite this length, the country is relatively narrow, with a maximum width of only about 125 miles. This elongated shape grants Cuba an extensive coastline, estimated to be around 2,320 miles. And this coast is marked by numerous bays and coves, with the largest being the Bay of Havana on the north coast and the Gulf of Guacanayabo in the south. The shoreline is also dotted with several archipelagos, with the Sabana-Camagüey archipelago to the north and the Canarios archipelago to the south, home to the famous Isle of Youth. Overall, Cuba's topography is varied. The western region is dominated by the Guanaguanaco mountain range, which includes the Sierra del Rosario and Sierra de los Órganos. These ranges are characterized by their limestone formations, known as mogotes, which create a distinctive karst landscape. The highest point in the west is Pan de Guayabon, peaking at just under 2,300 feet. The central region of Cuba is relatively flat and is home to some of the most fertile lands in the country. This area is vital for agriculture, particularly sugarcane and tobacco cultivation. The landscape here is a mix of rolling hills and plains, with the most notable feature being the Zapata Peninsula, known for its wetlands and as a habitat for a diverse range of wildlife. Finally, the eastern region is dominated by the Sierra Maestra mountain range, the highest in Cuba. This range includes Pico Turquino, the highest point in Cuba, standing at 6,476 feet. The Sierra Maestra is lush and heavily forested, offering a stark contrast to the drier regions of the country. It played a significant role in Cuba's history, particularly during the Cuban Revolution, as it served as a stronghold for revolutionary forces. And probably to the surprise of nobody, Cuba's climate is largely tropical, moderated by the island's position in the Caribbean Sea. The country experiences a wet season from May to October and a dry season from November to April. This climate, combined with varied topography, supports a rich diversity of plants and animals. The island is known for its palm trees, which are a symbol of the national landscape, and its mangroves, particularly in coastal areas. In terms of weather, the island's physical location makes it prone to hurricanes, which can be particularly devastating due to the island's narrow and elongated shape. Because hurricanes often run from east to west, this increases the likelihood of large portions of Cuba being impacted. But despite the hurricanes, Cuba is a relative tropical paradise, which raises the question, why have so many Cubans migrated to the US state of Florida? Florida, especially the city of Miami, has become synonymous with its large Cuban population, a demographic shift that began in earnest in the late 1900s and has had profound impacts on both the state and on Cuba itself. The genesis of Cuban migration to Florida can be traced back to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Following Fidel Castro's ascent to power, political and economic changes in Cuba, including nationalization of industries and suppression of dissent, led many Cubans to seek refuge elsewhere. Given Florida's geographic proximity to Cuba, just 90 miles across the Straits of Florida, it became the most logical destination for those fleeing the island. The first wave of Cuban immigrants, arriving in late 1950s and early 1960s, was primarily composed of the Cuban elite, business owners, professionals, and political leaders who were dispossessed by the revolution. The United States government, seeking to undermine Castro's communist regime, welcomed these refugees and provided assistance through the Cuban Refugee Program, which offered financial aid, English language training, and other resettlement services. Subsequent waves of Cuban migration were varied. The Freedom Flights, the largest and longest refugee airlift in American history, brought over 300,000 Cubans to the United States. The Mariel boat lift in 1980 was another significant event, where approximately 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida over a few months. Unlike earlier waves, many of these migrants were from poorer backgrounds and were less welcomed than their predecessors. This influx of Cubans has had a profound impact on Florida, particularly in Miami. The Cuban community has transformed the cultural, political, and economic landscape of the city. Little Havana, a neighborhood in Miami, epitomizes this influence with its Cuban restaurants, cafes, and shops. Politically, Cuban Americans have become a significant voting bloc, influencing local, state, and even national elections due to Florida historically being a swing state in determining the presidential election. The impact of this migration on Cuba has been equally significant. The exodus of many of its citizens, particularly during the early years of the revolution, led to a significant brain drain. Professionals, intellectuals, and skilled workers leaving the country impacted various sectors, from healthcare to education. Remittances sent back to Cuba by Cubans living abroad have become a crucial part of the island's economy, alleviating some of the economic hardships faced by those remaining on the island. This migration and cultural shift largely occurred due to the United States' obsession with Cuba after it realigned itself with the Soviet Union. The United States' relationship with Cuba is a complex one, marked by a blend of fascination, political intrigue, and ideological conflict. Despite the relative newness of the current US interest in Cuba, American interest in the country really began back in the 1800s, rooted initially in the expansionist concept of manifest destiny and the protectionist policy of the Monroe Doctrine. Cuba, a rich, sugar-producing Spanish colony, was seen as a natural addition to the expanding US sphere of influence. The notion of acquiring Cuba was entertained variously, either through purchase or as a spoils of war. particularly during the Mexican-American and Spanish-American Wars. The U.S. involvement in Cuba's struggle for independence from Spain culminated in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The war, sparked partly by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and fueled by sensationalist journalism, led to Cuba's independence from Spain. However, this independence came with strings attached, as evidenced by the Platt Amendment, which allowed the United States significant control over Cuba's foreign policy and economic affairs. Throughout the early 1900s, American businesses and mobsters invested heavily in Cuba, turning it into a playground for the wealthy and a site of economic exploitation. This period, however, ended abruptly with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which saw Fidel Castro's ascent to power and the establishment of an authoritarian government aligned with the Soviet Union. The revolution ignited a new phase of U.S. obsession with Cuba, now framed within the context of the Cold War. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by the CIA-backed Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the world stood at the brink of nuclear war, epitomized the heightened tensions between the two nations. Over the subsequent decades, the United States imposed a strict economic embargo on Cuba, aiming to isolate the island economically and politically. This embargo, which continues to this day, has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy towards Cuba, though its effectiveness and moral justification have been subjects of ongoing debate. The U.S. obsession with Cuba is also evident in its immigration policies. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 and the wet foot, dry foot policy, which was in place until 2017, offered preferential treatment to Cuban migrants. This policy established prioritized admittance for all Cubans who made it to the shore. However, those who were caught in the sea would be returned to Cuba. In recent years, there have been efforts to normalize relations between the United States and Cuba, notably during the Obama administration, which eased some travel and trade restrictions. However, these efforts have faced setbacks, reflecting the deep-rooted ideological and political divisions that continue to characterize the US-Cuba relationship. Cuba's involvement with the Soviet Union would have been a problem for the United States regardless of its geographic location. But the fact that Cuba is practically neighbors with the United States led to the overt obsession America has with the country. And because of that obsession, Florida has ended up with a huge Cuban population, and Cuba itself has remained economically isolated. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the history and geographic relationship between Cuba and the United States. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. If you want to watch more of my videos, you can do so here. If you want to listen to the podcast, click here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.